The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, The Path to Immortality. Maitreya Yajnavalkya said to his wife one day, "The time has come for me to go forth from the worldly life. Come, my dear, let me divide my property between you and Katyayani." Maitreya: "My lord, if I could get all the wealth in the world, would it help me to go beyond death?" Yajnavalkya: "Not at all. You would live and die like any other rich person. No one can buy immortality with money." Maitreya: "Of what use then are money and material possessions to me? Please tell me, my lord, of the way that leads to immortality." Yajnavalkya: "You have always been dear to me, Maitreya, and I love you even more now that you have asked me about immortality. Sit here by my side and reflect deeply on what I say. A wife loves her husband not for his own sake, dear, but because the self lives in him. A husband loves his wife not for her own sake, dear, but because the self lives in her. Children are loved not for their own sake, but because the self lives in them. Wealth is loved not for its own sake, but because the self lives in it. Brahmins are loved not for their own sake, but because the self lives in them. Kshatriyas are loved not for their own sake, but because the self lives in them. The universe is loved not for its own sake, but because the self lives in it. The gods are loved not for their own sake, but because the self lives in them. Creatures are loved not for their own sake, but because the self lives in them. Everything is loved not for its own sake, but because the self lives in it. This self has to be realized. Hear about this self and meditate upon him, Maitreya. When you hear about the self, meditate upon the self, and finally realize the self, you come to understand everything in life. For Brahmins confuse those who regard them as separate from the self. Kshatriyas confuse those who regard them as separate from the self. The universe confuses those who regard it as separate from the self. Gods and creatures confuse those who regard them as separate from the self. Everything confuses those who regard things as separate from the self. Brahmins, Kshatriyas, creatures, the universe, the gods, everything. These are the self. No one can understand the sounds of a drum without understanding both drum and drummer, nor the sounds of a conch without understanding both the conch and its blower, nor the sounds of a veena without understanding both veena and musician. As clouds of smoke arise from a fire laid with damp fuel, even so, from the Supreme have issued forth all the Vedas, history, arts, sciences, poetry, aphorisms, and commentaries. All these are the breath of the Supreme. As there can be no water without the sea, no touch without the skin, no smell without the nose, no taste without the tongue, no form without the eye, no sound without the ear, no thought without the mind, no wisdom without the heart, no work without hands, no walking without feet, no scriptures without the word, so there can be nothing without the self. As a lump of salt thrown in water dissolves and cannot be taken out again, though wherever we taste the water it is salty, even so, beloved, the separate self dissolves in the sea of pure consciousness, infinite and immortal. Separateness arises from identifying the self with the body, which is made up of the elements. When this physical identification dissolves, there can be no more separate self. This is what I want to tell you, beloved. Maitreya: I am bewildered, Blessed One, when you say there is then no separate self. Yajnavalkya: reflect on what I have said, beloved, and you will not be confused. As long as there is separateness, one sees another as separate from oneself, hears another as separate from oneself, smells another as separate from oneself, speaks to another as separate from oneself, thinks of another as separate from oneself, knows another as separate from oneself. But when the self is realized as the indivisible unity of life, who can be seen by whom? Who can be heard by whom? Who can be smelled by whom? Who can be spoken to by whom? Who can be thought of by whom? Who can be known by whom? Maitreya, my beloved, how can the knower ever be known? King Janaka of Vidya once performed a lavish sacrifice and distributed many gifts. Many wise men from Kuru and Panchala attended the ceremony, and Janaka wanted to know who was the wisest among them. So he drove 1,000 cows into a pen, and between the horns of each cow he fastened 10 gold coins. Then he said, "Venerable Brahmins, these cows are for the wisest one among you. Let him take them away." None of the other Brahmins dared to speak, but Yagnavalkya said to his pupil Samashrava, "Son, you can drive these cows home." "Hero of seers," his pupil exclaimed joyfully, and he drove them home. The other Brahmins were furious. How presumptuous, they shouted. And Ashvala, the royal priest, asked, "Yagnavalkya, do you really believe you are the wisest of those assembled here?" Yagnavalkya replied, "I salute the wisest, but I want those cows." Then Gargi, daughter of Vachaknu, said, "Venerable Brahmins, I shall ask Yagnavalkya only 2 questions. If he answers them well, no one here can defeat him in a spiritual debate." "Ask, Gargi," the sage replied. "Yagnavalkya, as a warrior from Kashi or Videha arises with bow and arrow to fell his opponent, I rise to fell you with 2 questions." "Ask them, Gargi." "That which is above heaven and below the earth, which is also between heaven and earth, which is the same through past, present, and future, in what is that woven, warp, and woof? Tell me, Yagnavalkya." Yagnavalkya, "That which is above heaven and below earth, which is also between heaven and earth, which is the same through the past, present, and future, that is woven, warp, and woof in space." Gargi, "My first question is answered well. Now for my second question." "Ask, Gargi." "In what is space itself woven, warp, and woof? Tell me, Yagnavalkya." Yagnavalkya, "The sages call it Akshara, the imperishable. It is neither big nor small, neither long nor short, neither hot nor cold, neither bright nor dark, neither air nor space. It is without attachment, without taste, smell, or touch, without eyes, ears, tongue, mouth, breath, or mind, without movement, without limitation, without inside or outside. It consumes nothing, and nothing consumes it. In perfect accord with the will of the imperishable, sun and moon make their orbits, heaven and earth remain in place, moments, hours, days, nights, fortnights, months, and seasons become years. Rivers starting from the snow-clad mountains flow east and west, north and south to the sea. Without knowing the imperishable, Gargi, whoever performs rites and ceremonies and undergoes austerities, even for many years, reaps little benefit, because rites, ceremonies, and austerities are all perishable. Whosoever dies without knowing the imperishable dies in a pitiable state. But those who know the imperishable attain immortality when the body is shed at death." The imperishable is the seer, Gargi, though unseen, the hearer, though unheard, the thinker, though unthought, the knower, though unknown. Nothing other than the imperishable can see, hear, think, or know. It is in the imperishable that space is woven, warp and woof. Gargi. Venerable Brahmins, count yourselves fortunate if you get away with merely paying this man homage. No one can defeat Yajnavalkya in debate about Brahman. With these words, Gargi ended her questions. Yajnavalkya came to Janaka, king of Videha, saying to himself, I will not talk today. But earlier, while they were discussing the fire ceremony, Yajnavalkya had promised him any boon he wanted. Now the king asked the sage permission to question him. Janaka, Yajnavalkya, what is the light of man? Yajnavalkya, the sun is our light, for by that light we sit, work, go out, and come back. Janaka, when the sun sets, what is the light of man? Yajnavalkya, the moon is our light, for by that light we sit, work, go out, and come back. Janaka, when the sun sets, Yajnavalkya, and the moon sets, what is the light of man? Yajnavalkya, fire is our light, for by that we sit, work, go out, and come back. Janaka, when the sun sets, Yajnavalkya, and the moon sets, and the fire goes out, what is the light of man? Yajnavalkya, then speech is our light, for by that we sit, work, go out, and come back. Even though we cannot see our own hand in the dark, we can hear what is said and move toward the person speaking. Janaka, when the sun sets, Yajnavalkya, and the moon sets, and the fire goes out, and no one speaks, what is the light of man? Yajnavalkya, the self indeed is the light of man, your majesty, for by that we sit, work, go out, and come back. Janaka, who is that self? Yajnavalkya, the self, pure awareness, shines as the light within the heart surrounded by the senses. Only seeming to think, seeming to move, the self neither sleeps, nor wakes, nor dreams. When the self takes on a body, he seems to assume the body's frailties and limitations. But when he sheds the body at the time of death, the self leaves all these behind. The human being has two states of consciousness, one in this world, the other in the next. But there is a third state between them, not unlike the world of dreams, in which we are aware of both worlds, with their sorrows and joys. When a person dies, it is only the physical body that dies. That person lives on in a non-physical body, which carries the impressions of his past life. It is these impressions that determine his next life. In this intermediate state, he makes and dissolves impressions by the light of the self. In that third state of consciousness, there are no chariots, no horses drawing them or roads on which to travel, but he makes up his own chariots, horses, and roads. In that state, there are no joys or pleasures, but he makes up his own joys and pleasures. In that state there are no lotus ponds, no lakes, no rivers, but he makes up his own lotus ponds, lakes, and rivers. It is he who makes up all these from the impressions of his past or waking life. It is said of these states of consciousness that in the dreaming state, when one is sleeping, the shining self who never dreams, who is ever awake, watches by his own light the dreams woven out of past deeds and present desires.